This meeting is being recorded.
Should we go ahead and get started? My friends can join us when they arrive. Does everyone feel okay with that? All right. Representative Hall, welcome. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Thumbs up. Yep.
Yep. No, this is good.
Okay, great. All right, welcome everybody. This is the PFAS Fund Advisory Committee meeting for December. My name is Stacy Brenner and I am one of the co-chairs. And we'll start with introductions. So we'll make our way around the room first, and then we'll engage with our folks that are joining us on Zoom.
Later today, maybe about making our
Thank you, Senator Brenner. Representative Jessica Fay. I represent House District 86, which is the towns of, this is the first time I've done this in real life now. The towns of Casco, Raymond, a part of Poland, and the town of Fry Island in the main house. And
those on Zoom have lost audio from the room.
All right, Representative Hall, if you.
There we go.
Great.
Can you hear me?
All right, let's try this. Representative Hall, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Stacy. Representative Randy Hall. I represent District 74, which is 9 towns in southern Franklin County, plus North New Portland over in Somerset County.
Senator Bennett? No, that's not going to work either.
Hi, I'm Rick Bennett. I have the honor of serving 14 towns in Western Maine, from Minot and Mechanic Falls through the Oxford Hills and the Lakes region of Cumberland County to the greater Freiburg area. Thank you.
Becca Bolus?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Becca Bolus. I'm Executive Director at Maine Public Health Association.
And Dr. Shaw?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Neerav Shaw from the Maine CDC. Sorry I can't be there in person. I had a bit of a family situation come up, but glad to be participating. Over.
Recognized. Anyone on Zoom? Can you hear us now?
Yep, we can.
Very good.
Better, okay. Yeah, just sneak out the window and holler. All right, so, hey, Representative Bay, do you wanna? Yeah. That's fine. Keep it going.
Sure,
Right, sorry. We have one more person to introduce.
Oh, sorry.
themselves.
Jim Buckle from the Buckle Farm in Unity, representing agriculture.
Keisha Holmes from
The farm in Albion, representing agriculture.
everyone had a chance to introduce themselves. So I just wanted to quickly remind us of the ground rules for the meeting. Basically, make sure that everyone has a chance to participate and that everyone feels comfortable and don't hesitate to speak up. And then the other one was, let's just make sure we're being respectful of each other and that we're gonna try to finish on time. So, Sarah Berners, you want me to go through the goals for the meeting as well? So, goals for today's meeting. We're going to try to identify initial priority areas for each topical area. We're going to talk about subcommittees and who wants to participate or who thinks that they're a good fit for which subcommittees. We're going to approve minutes. And as soon as Commissioner Beal gets back, we're going to talk about Jenny's question that she had at the end of the meeting last week. Does anyone have any questions? And maybe we could go ahead and, if people have had a chance to look at the minutes, go ahead and approve those. Sound good? Okay. We need a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
I'll make a motion. We approve the minutes from the January 11th meeting as submitted. Or November 11th, pardon me.
I'll second.
One favor? Any opposed? First vote, that went well.
I've stalled as long as I can. There she is.
So Amanda, we are gonna shoot it over to you. Jenny, I think you sent this to us via email after the meeting. And so this was a question that Jenny had about primarily transparency, I would say.
It was, and I apologize, I had to leave. I had a flight to catch, but my concern was, and question was about balancing privacy of private individuals with regards to medical information, as well as businesses and their exposure to any type of halo effect, not so positive, that might happen from the disbursement of funds, and balancing that all with the idea that there has to be a transparency and a trust with the public with regards to these funds as they're distributed.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that is one of those things where this is public funding. There are certain things that we are going to have to be transparent about, but I would think that any sensitive information we can work with. That's something that we'll need to work with the Attorney General's office with to kind of figure out where that balance is. But I think that's a really good point. It's a good question to raise.
I mean, and one of the reasons I started thinking about it, is it okay if I just speak like this? I'm sorry. Was, like when you're looking at USDA NAS information, there'll be an asterisk if it's something that actually people can figure out which farm or which business they're talking about. And then I was thinking about a lot of things, especially, I'll be honest, I was thinking a lot about dairy. If there is a claim or a payment with regards to some sort of fitting into one of these buckets to a farm, are they going to lose faith from customers and or our consumers? And does that result in a loss of market and contract? And it's sort of like, do you seek the help or do you not? And it's a really tough place to be. And that can lead to a lot of subterfuge and lack of disclosure and lack of forward movement. But I see the other side, I see all the sides. So that's why I brought it up. But anyways, thank you.
I think that's something that we'll be keeping in mind as we move forward. And generally speaking, when we do reports, it'll be in the aggregate, not identifying particular farms. But there may be times when we're called on to be more specific.
I'd be curious how that'd be handled, like under a FOIA request, because I know with us, federal dollars are, anyone who gets program payments, it's, federal funds, it's releasable under FOIA. So maybe think about that too.
Just, I don't know, is that what that is exactly? Is that like just like a more formal request?
Freedom of Information
Okay,
Act.
okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Sometimes all the abbreviations.
Privacy Act and all
That's
that.
the federal level and then the state.
That's the federal
Right,
funding,
okay,
yeah.
Right.
So I guess that's
Sure,
as much of an answer as
this
we have at this point, which is that we want to consider that.
And that's as much of an answer as I really wanted at this point. So thank you.
And then, I believe. This is yours. So this was what we did not get to at the end of last month's meeting, which is Dr. Smith's presentation about PFAS specifically in ag settings.
Track of that is going to be quite further on the calendar.
Maybe in a tug of war. I think you guys-
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, you let me know when it's up and I'll.
Maybe the mouse, but not the power.
Story of my life. So I was asked last time, and we'll be doing it today, to give you a sense of some of the research / field studies that are already underway to basically get information to help with short-term decision-making that's needed. In some cases, information that's very specific to a farm and issues on that farm and questions we need answered for them. Sometimes it's also to get information that may be more generalizable than that. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time on one part of this, which is generally our work of thinking about ability to predict how much is too much in soil for some of these agronomic pathways and field studies to support that. And then I'll end with just some really short vignettes to give you a sense of the scope of some of the other studies we have. So you'll get hopefully a fairly broad view of many of the ones that we have underway right now. So you let me know when you're.
I think we're good. If you just ask the Zoom audience if they can see the presentation.
Yeah.
We cannot.
Okay.
Sorry.
I think you need to, click on that one.
Let's share.
Should be there now. Looking good?
Yep,
All
thank
right.
you.
And is the mouse just press a button and it will advance?
Yes, left.
Roll. Oh, that's going to be. Yep. Okay. Yep. I get it. All right. So let me jump right into one area of work we have, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the study location. You're looking kind of an aerial view of a dairy farm, an organic dairy farm. The white boxes with numbers are telling you about the field average soil levels of the chemical PFAS. So I'm being very specific about this family of PFAS and only talking about one because it's the one we mostly see in milk. So it's a lot of the focus of work here. You can see that the field averages are quite variable at this one farm, over a 10-fold variation in just how much PFAS is in the soil, probably due to different practices of land application of residuals over many years. So going roughly in the 40s to over 200 part per billion as field averages. And then you'll see those two really low ones, 3 and 4. We believe those, the only source is manure spreading. So if it's in the animals, it's in the manure, If manure is applied to field, you're going to get some level of increase in soil levels from that as well. When we first found out about this farm, and this is a farm that's self-tested, that's how we learned about the farm, milk was at about 800 part per trillion. If you followed the action levels were developed, the current action level is 210, so this was above it. They have water wells serving the barn, but we tested them and they couldn't explain the milk levels that we're seeing. But the field and the fodder could. So this is mostly about a pathway. I'm moving, but it's not. There we go. Yeah. About this soil to hay to animal pathway. And the key questions, once we got involved here and from our involvement in some other dairy farms, was again, this, how much is too much PFAS in soil for growing hay or corn for dairy or beef animals? Are there differences in the uptake by hay and corn or other things that might be able to use to allow even fields with higher levels of PFAS still be used for something, have some value added to the farm? And then the other question was, can we successfully depurate our herd with elevated PFAS milk to get it to the point that it could sell milk again? Depurate here, I'm using that term to mean basically do something to intervene with their exposure so the natural body processes will slowly eliminate these chemicals. And let me just emphasize why they're forever in the soil, they're not forever in the animals. And there's big differences between animals in their ability to eliminate these chemicals. So part of what we're engaged in is both field studies, but it's also a modeling exercise. We'd like to be predictive. We'd like to be able to say, for this soil level, this is what we think the milk level could be. And that will help us as we get lots of soil data from all the testing our DEP colleagues are doing to think about when we might want to test the milk on that situation, as well as being able to use to help advise a farmer on whether you might want to grow corn versus hay. So these are mathematical models. It turns out EPA's already got them. So that was helpful. It's not like we're having to develop models, but you need inputs for any model. And one of the key inputs you need is this movement from the soil into the plant. There were only 2 studies published at that time, and one was in German. So, and that was grasses, didn't include sort of the mixed hay we saw. So that was kind of the motivation for us to do our own, whoops, I'll get this by the end, our own field studies. Little purple rectangles you see in those fields, there's 4 of them. Those are study plots. This is a very cooperative, collaborative farmer that allowed us to establish study plots on their land that we are using to go back and sample the pasture plants in those little roughly 25 by 125 plots. The picture on the upper right, you can see the team out there collecting hay samples. The person I'm calling out below is Heidi Pickett. She's actually a PhD student at Harvard. So one of the things we've done is be able to collaborate with other institutions. All they want is samples and then everything else is paid for. So it's a great deal for us to learn. And her specific focus is on precursors and how precursors may change and be evolved. So it's a great addition to our study team here. One of the challenges that all of us are going to face as we start to work in this PFAS area is it's not like there are established methods you can go out and use. You have to develop them. Even something as simple as trying to measure the uptake of PFAS from soil into plants. You have to come up with a protocol for doing it. We came up with ours, take a 1 by 1 foot area, cut all the hay out, it goes to a lab, they get it all ground up nicely, analyze it for PFAS. You get 3 soil cores, take out the roots, the rocks, the worms, and then get that nice and mixed. That gets analyzed for PFAS as well. And it's just the ratio of those, the amount in the PFAS in the soil, the amount in the plant gives us the transfer factors we need for those predictive models to be able to relate any soil level to what's in the crop. And this is just, I'm not going to show you a lot of data, but just to give you a sense of some of the data we get. All we're going to take from this is these transfer factors, again, they're just the ratio of what's in the plant to what's in the soil. A ratio of 1 means same concentration in the soil to what's in the plant. If it's less than 1, you've got less in the plant than you do in the soil. They're all less than 1. That's a good thing, but it still makes it in. What I want your eyes to take away from this is one of the surprises is how different the uptake is between different fields on the same farm, sampled on the same day in the same year. And at present, we don't have an explanation for that. Hopefully, our academic colleagues, when they get involved and start to look at this, may be able to help shine some light. We don't see as much difference on other farms, but it's just as you do things in this new world of PFAS, you find surprises. And that leads to having to do more work because you want to be able to predict. But if we're seeing this big variation between fields, it's not clear which number we should use. So you can always use the upper and be super conservative or an average, but this is an area that have now gone back and done it 2 years in a row. We've had 2 different laboratories analyze the results, so it's not an anomaly. We feel pretty confident that this is a real finding, but it's one we're still scratching our heads off to explain it. And so what we'll be doing is looking at other farms to see if we can see the same sort of pattern. Yes,
Are we taking questions or not to the end?
I'm happy to do whatever the committee wants to do.
I'm just curious. I'm sure you've looked at this, but the fields that have the higher level in the hay, were those the fields that had higher level in the soil? Like, what's the comparison there?
No,
Or does it matter?
we have looked, we don't see any clear dependence on the concentration of the soil to what the transfer factor would
You
be.
said that, I apologize.
Yeah, no, I did not. But remember, this transfer ratio is just a function of it's a ratio of what's in the soil. So you're kind of accounting for it, but it's a good question to ask. Does this mean, is how well it's taken up a function of how much is there to begin with? And that's a really good question. And we checked it. We don't see evidence of that. So there's something else. We've got soil fertility measures. Nothing's jumping out with pH or cation exchange or percent organic matter, which have also been, so we're still scratching our head as to what's going on here.
Soil structure.
Could be soil structure, but we now have a soil scientist collaborating with us from the University of Maine. So we're starting to look at that. Nothing has really jumped out from the preliminary data we have on that. So
System architecture. Are the
Yes.
plant species the same?
roughly, so especially if you look at that plot 8 versus 5-1, both pretty much Timothy grass and a little bit of alfalfa. The agronomists have really been working on teaching me farming 101. So
You said that with authority.
I know.
Does soil type and slope have anything to do with it?
Again, we're starting to look at soil type now to see if there's anything there. The initial sense we got from the soil scientists involved is no, doesn't look like it. They're all in a little bit of a slope, nothing super steep, but they all have a little bit of slope because the farmer is still applying manure and we didn't want it draining onto our plots. So we picked them with that sort of eye in mind. So,
Cool, thank you.
yeah, good questions. Yes.
Have the fields always been the grass, or had they possibly been another forage before when the other farms had owned it? And did they all get the same applications? Is it possible different products were put there? Is that possible?
It is possible, and that's a level of detail I don't have right now. What I will tell you, it's a site where I believe historically it was in corn. It's probably when a lot of the land application happened. There may have been some slopes that affected just how much was applied over time. And then when they went from being a beef farm to an organic dairy farm, they switched all the fields over to pasture. And so they were in pasture for a good 5 to 6 years. And it's only now that the farmer is switching them back to corn so they can still access the field. So yes, they've had a bit of a mixed history. We're on this same farm as well as another farm. We're also looking at the uptake into corn for silage versus other corn products. So when we're looking at corn for silage, that just means the entire stalk. They cut it at 6 to 8 inches or so. The whole thing gets ground up and fed as a silage out of bunkers to the animals. So we're trying to mimic that. We cut the entire stalk, chop it, put it in a bag. And the laboratory is these really enormous stainless steel vats that they add a lot of dry ice to, freeze it, and then grind it up into a nice powder. That bag is showing you corn silage after the laboratory's prepared it for analysis. So nice uniform, that's an important thing to have for the sample. For snaplets, that's just the corn ear with the husk, with the kernels, with a little bit of the shank attached. It's something that a farmer can harvest without too much additional equipment. And there was literature suggesting very little uptake into the kernels, so we thought that might be lower. Earlage requires a bit more equipment. That's going to be minus the husk and the shank. So it's now just the cob and the ear, cob and the kernels. And we've also looked at kernels separately so that we can look at possibilities of different crops a farmer may be able to use in some of these soils. higher averages. And here again, another one of these transfer factors, it's less than one, right? Quite a bit less than one. So it's not a lot of uptake into corn, but clearly the light bars are corn silage. The small green, dark green bars are corn snaplage. So what it's showing you is how much less uptake there is into corn for snaplage than corn for silage. So that's actionable information for a farmer now, if it works out for them to sacrifice the ability to grow corn silage, which is a larger amount of forage that they're getting, versus corn snaplage, which is going to be only a portion. So the yield is a lot less. But if they want to use that land, in some cases, it may be the only option. And in fact, that's what this farmer has done. All these fields with 20 and higher part per billion, they have now switched from pasture to corn silage. I'm sorry, corn for snaplage, and you can see that's the snaplage ground up being packed into a bunker. And the good news here is that we have been able to, the farmer and our DACF colleagues working with the farmer, have been able to successfully depurate this herd from around 800 part per trillion. I think the latest results were 43 part per trillion. So, so a lot of hard work to get there, but it has been possible through, again, a mixture of really paying attention to what they're feeding the animals, converting some of these fields to snaplage, and just a lot of time. So next steps here is we're actually taking our plots and reseeding them so that we can look at grasses separately from legumes. We also want to look at new crops versus old crops. So that's kind of the plan for future study on this site. We are now starting to look at other farms so we can see how generalizable this is by going to different farms and doing that same sort of co-located soil and a sampling in those 1x1 foot products. And then once we get that, we'll update our soil screening levels that we currently have once we have all that information. So again, all actionable information, both specific to this farm as well as generalizable, we hope, to other farms. So let me now just quickly switch to this is the part of the talk that I'm just going to 1 or 2 slides per topic area to give you a sense of the other work. One is now that we've encountered some farms that are vegetable farms on old, probably dairy or beef farms that had history of land application and encountering soils with elevated levels of PFAS and other PFAS. The question is uptake into vegetables, which again, there's not a lot of published field data. Some greenhouse studies, some potted plant, but not much. So what we've done with our colleagues at DACF is when they go out to sample, they're adopting the methods we're using of these 1x1 plots, co-located soil, so we can get plant transfer factors for vegetables that we can then use hopefully in the future in a predictive way, as well as helping the farmer in question. So here's just showing you sampling some lettuce, sampling some, I think that's bok choy, if I remember correctly. And you can see the soil holes as well as the plant material. And here's just to give you a sense of the figure again, transfer factors, a lot less than 1. So there's not an accumulation into plant, but some movement. And I don't know who's keeps going on top of my figure there. The asterisks that you're seeing means we can only give you an upper bound because when we tested it, it was non-detect. So all we can do is say for this soil level, it could be as high as this. But I want you to see just how different the uptake is based on different vegetables. And in some ways, it might make sense, leafy greens, but I don't have a good explanation for why asparagus and rhubarb are so much lower as stem crops than, say, some of the leafy greens. But we couldn't measure PFAS in the asparagus or rhubarb, despite having soils that were over 100 to 300 part per billion. So there's just important to recognize that there's real differences between different crops in their propensity to take these up. And that's an important finding. And whenever we now encounter a vegetable farm with elevated soil levels, we're looking for opportunities to gather more data in these sort of what I call sort of opportunistic observational studies.
So in that slide there, it seems that there's subtle trends around the fruiting body versus the leaf material or the vegetative material of the plant, but it doesn't seem to be completely standard. Is that what you're finding? Like, for example, you're seeing like, you know, much more elevated levels in lettuce and spinach and
Arugula
Yeah.
and,
Swiss chard.
yeah. And
And much less so in the fruiting body.
in the
like
fruiting
tomato
bodies, yes.
or
In general, the literature seems to suggest, and what we're seeing with our own data is you will see very little uptake into fruit. And there's some theories about that, but in general, we're not seeing much, whether it's tomatoes, whether it's cukes, whether it's, raspberries, things like that. They're just peas. There seems to be little uptake into peas. We've done one homestead over the raising green beans. We didn't see much uptake into the green beans there. So that seems to be a somewhat generalizable finding so far. And also for some of the storage crops, like we see very little uptake into potatoes, into the tubers. So, and if I could, and I'll get you a question, but interestingly, if you look at the green portion of the plants, plenty of uptake into the tomato greens, into the cucumber greens, etc. Even though you're not seeing it in the fruit. So it's making it into the plant. It's just not getting transported into the fruit. Yes.
So that you actually answered my question, but now I have another. My question was, what about the parts of the plant that is the green? So that is that which is cast aside or reincorporated back into the soil is a perpetuation of the issue.
It could be, yes. So for example, if you think of like grains, right? So you're growing the grains for the grain, but you might use the straw as bedding or something else. So you could still have it in there. But if it's going back, remember, it's going to be a fraction of what's in the soil. If it's going back to a field that's already high, perhaps that's still an option. Yes.
Do you see like a controlled plot study of vegetable uptake where like actually planting crops in a created contaminated bed and getting a long list?
Yes, we would love to see, and that's being talked about. So I think
this isn't all the list of things that have been turned in for the
No.
study, right? There's
Right.
much more.
There's much more to do, as well as there's a real need to be doing controlled studies. So these are observational studies because there are people that need answers now.
Yeah.
And it can take time to get, these sort of well-controlled studies that will help us better understand mechanistically or all the variables that are going on. And that I think is the stage we want to get to, but that takes time. Whereas right now, we've got people that need to know where they're going to plant next year, but they're not. So we've been just going at it in this sort of two-part, right? Observational to get as much data as we can now when the opportunity presents itself, and then start to build capacity, share knowledge, et cetera, as we get ready to move into the more controlled study.
Cool. Thank you.
Good with that? Here's an example of another type of work we're doing, and I should really, this is a shout out to our DACF colleagues, especially one of our assistant state veterinarians. If you're thinking about slaughtering an animal, you would like to know the PFAS levels before you slaughter the animal. And the one way we're looking at doing that is possibility of a blood test. So measuring the blood in the animal, but that means you need to have pairs of blood and tissue in order to be able to work out that relationship. So you can use blood in the future to predict what tissues are. And that's Megan Flanagan out getting a blood serum from a beef animal. And then you're looking, in this case, we actually wanted to get live animal tissue biopsies as well. So the animal with the big shaved area and the suture line is an animal that had a small tissue biopsy in order to get that for being analyzed. So we have paired serum and tissue data that either we get them at slaughter time or we get them on these live animal studies as well. But just another example of the type of work we're engaged in to get actionable information in the short term, to be able to help farmers know, for example, if you know what the numbers are now, you could make a decision to hold sending that animal to slaughter for 2, 3, 6 months if possible, because the data indicates that the half-life in beef tissue is on the order of 2 months or less for some of these chemicals. So that can be factored into whether or not it's worth feeding them that long and holding them to get to that, what we call a deparation period. So again, key actionable information. I think we have 20, I think 15, 20 animals we've now got data on that we've been doing this. And we're working collaboratively with the state of Michigan that's doing similar studies so that we can all bring our data together and try to get this worked out sooner than later. I think the last
Hey,
one,
Andy. Andy,
yes.
this is Nirav. The point that you just made there about the natural clearance rate from livestock and in parallel with agricultural products, really, really important, I think. And I want to ask you to spend just another second on it, because we label these chemicals forever chemicals, which gives the impression that once they are in an organism, animal or plant, they are there forever. And you know what you just said, I think bears just a little bit deeper treatment to give people some reassurance that in time the bodies actually do clear them, whether it's human, cattle, et cetera. Could you just go into that a little bit more, how that happens, et cetera?
Sure. It's a little bit complicated as to how it happens, but let me just talk empirically first. So the term we use, I believe Senator Bennett asked me about it last time, is half-life. So it's once you stop exposure, how long does it take the level in a body, say blood compartment or milk or whatever, to decrease by 1/2? So if you're 100 now, how long would it take you to get to 50? If you're 50 now, how long to 25? Unfortunately, for humans, for PFAS and PFOA, that's like 2 to 5 years, the half-life in us. For the cow, for the beef compartment, the muscle compartment, it's more like 70, 80 days for PFAS and for PFNA, a 9-carbon version of it, it's actually like 2 weeks. And for PFOA, which we're really concerned about for our exposures, you can't even measure it in beef tissue because it's eliminated so rapidly. So that's another part of it, is they're really different depending on which PFAS you're talking about in terms of how fast they're eliminated from it. For chicken and eggs, it's like 3 to 5 days. So once you get them on clean feed before you'll get down to having, it'll take only 3 to 5 days to go down by about 1/2. So really rapid for those. So just big differences between livestock, big differences between individual PFAS, and big differences between livestock and us in terms of how rapidly it is. Unfortunately, and this gets a little bit of where you were going, is this elimination doesn't mean it's being destroyed or broken down or anything. It's just cycling. So the way we're eliminating is if we've got PFAS in us, we're just eliminating PFAS. Cows eliminating PFAS via milk and feces, they're just putting out PFAS. So they're just passing it through. Unfortunately, it's not a breakdown, just passing it through. So you can, if you're on cycling everything on the farm, just be kind of somewhat keeping it there, except for the things that leave the farm. So that's why they're called forever, because this chemical structure with these carbon fluorine bonds are so strong, they're really hard to break down. So chickens, we've thus far our work with chicken eggs has been mostly with homesteaders raising their own backyard chickens. Originally, this work came up because they had really highly contaminated water, wanted to know when their eggs were safe to eat. So we agreed to test their eggs through a small pot of money we had from an EPA grant. Sure enough, once we get them on clean water, they came down rapidly, just like the literature said they would. We decided just to be sure, we'd go back out in June and test them again, and they had popped right back up. And ever since then, we've been working for the past 1.5 years on trying to understand this soil, the chicken, the egg pathway, because if the chickens are outside and the soil has elevated levels, it looks like it can really be transferred to the egg. So we're trying to understand how much you need in the soil to know when you're concerned about eggs, and that's work that's currently underway as we try to understand that pathway, but we've been surprised. So this is actually an example where, again, a really motivated homesteader who really wants his eggs. So we tested them after they were out there, and then he came in and brought in about 1 foot of clean sand over to interrupt that soil pathway of the old soil. And now we're following his eggs to make sure they're going down to see if we can interrupt the soil pathway that way and confirm it's a soil pathway. So again, kind of an opportunistic type study. It'd be great to do this in a more controlled way, but we're just trying to get answers to questions.
And in that instance, did you test meat tissue at all, or was it just the eggs?
Just the eggs in here, so. there are published studies that have looked at feeding controlled diets to chicken and looking into the broiler meat as well. And I think that's it, other than just to point out, we're able to do this work because we have a lot of collaborators. And when we go out in the field, we usually have a team of 8 to 10. Our DEP colleagues are always donating some of their field people to us. There's Rick Kersbergen from the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. There, El Gusen from MOFCA has been involved in helping us as well. So a lot of folks are trying to help us sort this out. Thank you. If there's any other questions?
Yeah. Anyone on Zoom with a question?
I have a question as far as like, what your plan is as far as the data that you are collecting, how you are planning, like, are you planning on dispersing that data in any way to farmers before it's like a finalized study? I guess I'm kind of curious as you're doing, like, when I think about the benefit of these on-farm, short, kind of more like on-farm studies, how can there be better benefit to a broader group of farmers by knowledge you're creating, even though it's not like, you know, I'm sure you're hesitant to like put a stamp on like, this is for, you know, because of their field studies, like how you foresee that information being disseminated.
Yeah, I'll tell you, and Nancy can jump in here too. Sorry, Director. Brandon can jump in here as well. I think we've tried to put our typical scientist hat aside and not be hesitant to go out with preliminary data. We've been giving talks all over the country and weekly to a group in Australia. So, and been sharing data as it, you know, as soon as we can put it in nice figures like that, we've been sharing it because we don't have the answers and we're looking for feedback. So I've probably done dozen plus at various meetings, conferences, briefing federal agencies, briefing other states. Whenever Nancy invites me to give a talk to the Maine Dairy Association, the Maine Beef Association, the Agricultural Trade Show, we're out there talking about the data as we're getting it. So I think we recognize everyone wants answers and we're just trying to share as it comes in, with the caveat that, you know, things will change as we learn. But we are trying to get the data out there. It's the other issue, I think, is frankly time. So if thankful we have more staff, but you know, I'm trying to protect one of my toxicologists just to do data analysis through January and February that we need to do in order to get people out. So that just depends on what else comes at us, but hopefully we can do that. And once we get that done, we'll feel much more comfortable about putting something out. I think we have a nice developing relationship with University of Maine Cooperative Extension, where we come up with the data and it's their job to disseminate it because they've got those channels they can take, and then we don't have to do that work. So we can just analyze it, get the data, here it is, and say, can you make products to go out and get it out to farmers? So I think that's another way we're looking at how we can work collaboratively with that. And they have all their channels for communication that we don't have. So it allows us to stay focused. That kind of.
Yeah, no, I guess I was just curious how that all transfers.
Yeah, and it's all evolving.
Yeah.
We all try to figure out how to work together.
Yeah.
Are you testing any farm inputs? Like, you know, on our farm, it's like plastic, T-tape, fertilizers and all that. Have you tested any farm inputs coming from that are beyond just this material that was applied years ago, like newer ones?
Yeah.
Or pesticides or anything like that? Any results in that?
The only ones that I've been involved in is some grain early on, but at this point, the exposure source has been so obvious. We're really focused on, you know, these, you know, we're dealing with these really pretty elevated soil levels. And it's pretty clear that's dominant pathway. We're always looking at water, so we understand how much a water pathway is. And I don't want to dismiss that there are certainly some farms where it's all about water. So they have wells that are really high. They have no history of land application, but they've been irrigating. So there's that whole pathway, which is also another challenging modeling area, because it's different than just if you just have contaminated soil. It's a propensity to take it out. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Sure.
And then I think we're gonna bring Keith back.
Yeah, so if I could get the notes back. So I want to talk about the discussion guide. I have paper copies if anyone would like one. I've distributed to the committee members ahead of time. As the name suggests, I put this together to help guide our conversation. And there's that series of questions on the first page that I want to go through and answer yes or maybe. Are we going to fund short-term research like the time factors, like the sort that Dr. Smith was just speaking about? I don't want to, I know it would be very tempting to want to dive into the details of, well, what does it mean to fund short-term research? That is the work for the subcommittees. So if you think of this discussion guide and that series of questions, we're just sketching the outline of the program. What are our priorities? And then the subcommittees, they're going to fill in the detail and the color of how do we get there. And how we get there with the subcommittees, I had reached out to each of you before this meeting today. I'm thinking that we need at least 4 subcommittees to start with: research, income replacement, infrastructure, and business consulting. That could maybe be called something different: direct support to farmers, land transfers, and blood testing and medical monitoring. I have this flip chart behind me where I have indicated where people had a preference. I've listed them there. I've also identified our chairs of each subcommittee. So for research, Amanda Beal and Diane Rowland. For land, Sherry Hamill and Alex Redfield, who is not a member of this advisory committee, but he does work for DACF. He's sitting over against the wall there. And among his many responsibilities is responsible for Farmers for Maine's Future. The Income Replacement, Infrastructure, and Business Consulting Subcommittee will be co-chaired by Nancy McBrady and Adrian Lee. And the Blood Testing Medical Monitoring will be co-chaired by Dr. Shah and Becca Bolas. So as we have our conversations today, if any of you here want to volunteer yourselves for any of the subcommittees, please do. If you have recommendations for other folks who aren't here, but you feel they have the necessary expertise or their involvement will be necessary for implementation, then please recommend to those folks as well. I anticipate the subcommittees meeting in January, February, and March. I don't think we will meet as a full committee in January because I want to give the subcommittees time to think about the path forward and the details that sort of fact finding. What do we need to know to best serve the purposes of the fund? I want the subcommittees to propose specific actions and to also begin estimating the budgetary needs. All of that won't happen in your January meetings. You know, that is going to be spaced out. But that's sort of the charge of the subcommittees. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts on subcommittees right now? So also as part of this discussion guide, I'm sure you noticed it's all full of tables. The first column is term, short-term or long-term. There's the legislative authority, there are existing programs, if any. In the fourth column, that's really where we're going to be spending our time today. Fund could ... And this column corresponds to that list of questions on the first page. But before we dig into that, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with definitions of terms. I've defined short-term as supports that can be provided within the first 12 months after elevated levels of PFAS are discovered.
And long-term as activities that are expected to be ongoing or something that cannot be resolved within 12 months. And then building on those terms, goals of the PFAS fund, short-term would be support for farmers while they investigate and consider options. So really that's in that first 12-month time frame after the discovery of elevated levels. Long-term goal of the fund would be to enable farms and farmers to thrive in their new circumstances and to prioritize land use options that do not foreclose the possibility of return to agricultural production. So let's pause here and I welcome feedback on these definitions. Adrian?
I question the concept of short-term just being 24 months or 12 months. Just in the sense that I think as farmers, like 12 months, like, I mean, yeah, I feel like there's like, and this isn't necessarily related to how we decide on funding of different things, but it's like if we're thinking about a short-term or long-term effect, I think like 12 months just barely, like one season doesn't really feel like a very adequate definition in that sense. And that also could play into our decision making. And I think there's a big difference between like, you know, the 3 to 5 year plan or the long-term plan, especially when we're talking about land that's like potentially like contaminated forever and like how those variations are. And so like, and also with someone that is like a farmer that's discovering this 12 months is just like, I would almost say the initial processing period, not necessarily even like move in action. It's hard to make too much action in that much time. So I'm kind of curious how that us just adopting these concepts will affect our decision making and how we look at like supporting farms. If it's a 12-month or long, if like those are the two questions. That would be a question.
I want to back Adrian up on this because I think most of our planning probably is like a 3 to 5 year vegetable or crop plan. And yeah, 1 year may not be open. With my experience this summer with our contamination, 12 months, I just am getting to the like 9-10 month mark and I still feel like I don't know what I'm gonna do come May. And so I think like at least 18 or even more than 4 months would seem more adequate to consider that to be short term. I don't, if it's a longer length, you know.
Yeah, I would just say 12 just seems really inadequate.
Yeah, because if you landed in the middle of a season, let's say in June, July, you hear that this is happening and your business plan changes so much. We're having a hard time getting people back on marketing board, even just after like, you know, just to buy our product again, even after just 9 months. And I don't think that it will really solve itself over the season. So yeah, I just want to support these comments here.
And I'm simply piling on to support it because not only is it just emotionally and seasonally a very short period of time, but depending upon when that discovery is made in the cycle, it is almost a logistical you're not getting a full 12 months.
No.
You've already made your decisions. You've already literally fed your soil already. There's nothing you can do. I do think that 24 months would be far more reasonable and more productive and constructive. But
Perhaps there's a third definition. There's like an immediate, short term, and a long term. So you have some immediate responses that happen at the point of discovery, and then you have short term, which could be 24.
like that, because that speaks to that whole shock and awe. I think we've all had these conversations.
It seemed like that if we did do that initial, like what happens when someone is discovered with this or a farm is discovered that problem, like something that needs to go with that is like a welcome packet. Welcome to what do you do? It's like for us, it was thankfully we had like 4, 5, 6 months ahead of us that had already like taken the initial blast of it, but like, you know, farmer might not know what they're actually dropping into. If they know that first little, in a month, we do this, and then we start this 24-month short-term period, and then step into something longer. Yeah.
That could be a whole subcommittee for welcome.
Here's the blanket for your fetal position, dumping all the time.
Yeah.
So a number of people said 24 months, but Adrian also up to 5 years. Are people comfortable with 24 or?
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to describe, I was trying to describe the concept of like 12 months just feels like a blink of an eye on a farm.
What about something along the lines of like rapid response? Like you said, welcome packet, right? Rapid response, and then, okay, what do we do next? And then, how do we go? What I heard was that initial, oh my God, what do we do now? Response needs, I think, a different mechanism or a different attitude almost than, okay, now that you know, what are we gonna do after that? And I think Senator Brenner's point of having kind of that interim makes sense.
And that's not only applicable to farmers either.
Oh, yeah, no, with water, with any kind of contamination. Okay.
So as we, let's dive into the research tables. And you'll see in that first column, I have short and long term, but we'll keep this conversation in mind that, short term could be split into both immediate and then a up to 24-month period. So the it's too small for me to see from here, so I need to look at paper version. The statute directs the fund to consider supporting research that supports short-term decision-making. So this would be the type of opportunistic type research that we just heard about. And is this something that we agree the fund ought to be spent on? Yes.
Yes.
Are you looking for like a vote on these, or like how kind of feedback? Yeah, I'm curious what.
Yeah, just yes or no. And
May I ask the question?
yeah.
Thanks. So there are things under the statute that we must do, and there are things that we may do, or that the fund may do. And so in advising the fund, I want to make sure personally that we're mindful of the statute and that the must activities are actually attended to appropriately. And I don't really have a sense of like the quantums of money that might be available in each of these categories, and particularly the musts. What is it that we must do, and when will we feel like we're doing it?
Right.
And then looking at whatever's residual and saying, okay, how do we most effectively deploy these funds on the things we may do?
Right. So everything in these tables today are things we may do. They're all discretionary. The things we must do is a fairly short list. Develop a plan, take a thoughtful approach to doing so, seek public comment, administer the fund in accordance with the plan, establish a short-term assistance program, and report to the legislature annually. And then this advisory committee must make recommendations to the department, hold 2 public hearings annually, be open to the public, consider a PFAS study plan, which is something that Dr. Rowland discussed or sort of structured her presentation around at our last meeting, and again, report to the legislature annually. So with the exception of establishing a short-term assistance program, really what we spend the money on is, those are the outline that I wanted to discuss today.
So do we have a sense of what the cost is for that short-term assistance plan? I got this from legislative testimony. It could be rather vast. I just don't have a sense of it myself.
Yeah, so that research study plan, which is kind of a mix of short-term and long-term peer-reviewed study, the total tally for that is $16 million, but that almost certainly will not be entirely funded by the PFAS contamination fund. If you reference back to that plan, other sources of funding, including USDA, are listed as potential sources of funding. So, that's one thing I want the subcommittees to work on is to identify how this opportunistic research has been funded to date, to get a sense of what sort of funding would be necessary to move forward. And we won't be making any budgetary definitions or decisions until we have recommendations from all the subcommittees on, how much we spend on short-term research, long-term research, medical monitoring, blood testing, direct assistance. And until we have that fully populated, we can't start dividing up the pie.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I just reflecting on that just quickly, and then I'll move on. But I was the short-term assistance piece. It sounds like we're one fund of various sources, some which may be emerging, that will be providing short-term assistance. Some have already done that, right, with generous non-governmental sources. I just want to make sure we cover that appropriately. If like the federal government is providing more funding and that's going to cover a lion's share of that, that's the information that's really challenging. As I was thinking about the questions and should we do this, that, or the other thing among these optional things, how much we should do. I'm kind of like, yeah, well, let's do all of it, but I don't have a sense of what is the most effective use of the funds. And I'll just leave it at that because it's going to be an emerging reality, I think, for us.
Yeah, fair questions that we will be diving into as this process moves along.
May I just add one thing?
Yeah, please.
Senator, I'm Nancy McBrady. I'm the director of the Bureau of Ag. And I just wanted, to your concern about sort of immediate short-term response, I do want to make clear that the Bureau and the department does have a budget at present that allows us to support the farms that we are working with and more farms as they are discovered. So to provide whether it's testing, water filtration, some income replacement through a process that we've stood up in this last year, as well as covering some costs or infrastructure investments. So we are prepared to continue to do that, and in fact want to continue to do many of those tasks. The question and the predicament is, at what point do we have farms access this fund? But for the foreseeable future, we are not laying off the gas pedal in terms of providing the assistance that I just mentioned.
And how much money is that so far?
I have some rough numbers. And this does not include testing, but for instance, with the farm viability, that's the catch-all for infrastructure investments, clean feed, that type of thing. We've received requests of 413,000 and have paid 159,000 and will be paying close to another 130 soon. We've, et cetera. And with income replacement, where we've provided some funding to a number of farms, that has been a tally of $512,000 with some pending requests outstanding.
Great, thank you so much. That's helpful.
So to return to this table here, yeah, I'm looking for a yes or no. Do we want to pursue, in this particular case, short-term opportunistic research? Really, yes or no, and then we'll figure out what that looks like, how much it's going to cost. And once we have that level of detail, we can make more informed decisions about how much will be allocated to each of the priorities we identified today.
I would say yes.
Yes. Okay. Any objections?
I don't have an objection, but I do have a question. Which is, actually pursuant to what Nancy said, which is, are there other entities that are funding this research? Do we know how much that is? And what is the overlay, the intersection between that type of research versus what would happen here? I heard Dr. Smith say, that they're doing this, right? This observational research right now. So the funding, for CDC to do that is coming from the CDC budget currently. Is that going to be, no, it's coming from, oh, you're still here.
I'm sorry.
No, okay, so that is coming from the ag budget.
Initially DEP, then
I
Mofca
remember
got
that.
foundation fund to get the work going, as allowing for you in the legislature to appropriate funds. And that is now supporting all of the work that, other than personnel, that we do, is being funded through DACF.
I just think that's something to keep in mind, like, because it's different pots of money.
Sure.
And how those interact. So that's just how I think about it.
If I could, but just to give you an example of the point that I think Nancy was making of trying to figure out this line. If they're just doing a response to a farm and they want to know what's in the crop, they may just go sample it and there's a budget and they're done. If we get involved in saying, oh, chance to get data to help us understand plant uptake, can you give triplicates instead of a single sample now? And can you get co-located soil? So all of a sudden what they thought was going to be 2 samples at $300 a pop, it becomes 6, 8, 10. That's partly what we're talking about, is trying to figure out where that line is when we switch from just direct data to support a decision versus getting something that's more generalizable and it's going to cost more to give us that sort of thing. So
That's helpful. Thanks for that.
Really.
that's, I think, important thing to recognize. That's kind of what we're dealing with. And right now, the only game in town for funding that work is the funds that they currently have. So,
And I can provide information on funding that we've received through various sources, federal sources and one internal source. And like I said, it'll be the work of the subcommittees to fill in that detail, to do the fact finding. Where's the money coming from now? How much is being supported? And what are needs going forward?
Slightly ignorant question, but if we decide to pursue and want to fund something, we're not saying that we can't possibly look for other funding sources or accept money elsewhere. That's like unspoken, but it's written down somewhere, right? So nobody has to feel that they have to say, no, I don't want to prioritize that because I think we may get money from another source later.
Right. At this point, it's just the general outlines. What do we want to try to get our arms around?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I heard yes to short-term opportunistic research.
Yes.
Okay.
And if I just might add one last thing, sorry to get, but another thing too is conceptually, the research doesn't necessarily have to be funded soup to nuts through this fund. It could also be match dollars, because I do think USDA will fund, EPA will fund, private foundations will be funding with PFAS as a overarching through line. That doesn't make sense. Overarching theme. But yeah, so just being as creative about how we can maximize these funds without necessarily having to do the whole lift.
Yeah, match is an important consideration, certainly for federal dollars. So now I've highlighted this whole big section that I've classified as long-term research, and this is more of that controlled, peer-reviewed research. The legislature identified a variety of different types of research, PFAS testing and data management capacity, research that quantifies the impact of PFAS, research on soil and water remediation systems, research on alternative cropping systems, PFAS uptake, livestock systems, food safety criteria, long-term monitoring. And the legislation also references the PFAS study plan, and contained in that is a recommendation for a PFAS research advisory panel to make recommendations regarding research priorities for PFAS. I'm suggesting that this fund could establish a competitive grant program from this type of academic research. I'm not sure that, well, we certainly have some scientists on this committee. We're not all scientists, and even, there are different disciplines that ought to be drawn in. So I'm thinking that rather than this body of 15 try to divide up this academic research, that instead we give some thought to constituting an academic PFAS advisory panel, which could then make recommendations in terms of what sort of long-term research do we want to fund.
So kind of confused. Are you proposing, like, when you say a program, are you saying like the funding for this, like the funding for a competitive grant research, or are you suggesting that we help try to establish like the panel, an advisory panel? That's because
So
yeah.
2 steps. So
Okay.
establish an advisory. I guess, is there agreement that we ought to have competitive grants for research? So then people, researchers would apply for funding to conduct research. And then if we want to do that, we need a process for doing it. So we would work with an advisory panel to help identify, or I guess there are 2 steps. This group could identify the priorities. What do we want to spend research dollars on? Would it be mitigation measures in the field, like now that you've identified PFAS contamination, how do you respond? Do we want to emphasize identification of PFAS? Do we want to prioritize remediation? So how do we get it out of the soils, for example? So there are layers of responsibility. This advisory committee can establish kind of broad priorities where we want money to go. Then an advisory panel with the appropriate scientific credentials can then solicit and vet those proposals from researchers to help us to make wise investments with those dollars.
Seems to me like this is a section that would be well-funded in other ways. It seems like there should be other funding out there for this type of research.
There is some, as Nancy mentioned, a lot of federal funding requires match. So they will give X number of dollars if the research institution comes up with matching funds from some other source. So potentially this fund could be that match.
I would just add in, something to think about is, as she said, there is a lot of research being funded regarding PFAS. So if you're going to dedicate money from this fund, this $60 million fund, right? At some point when we get to prioritization of, how we divide up the pie, I would caution thinking about this at least narrow specifically to agricultural, because you can start to talk about lots of other research that's relevant for agricultural soils, but is more about soils in general. And so, in terms of getting into research, I guess I would say, I'm not sure that there's going to be anything on this list that we would say, no, we don't want to fund it, but then it's going to be, how does it rank in comparison to other things, and where there is, other potential funding opportunities that maybe aren't agricultural specific, but could get to the same information that you'd be looking for. And if it's going to be a competitive grant program, we hear from everybody now that they've got the coolest thing to break up the compounds. They've got the best technology. Every researcher under the sun wants us to sign on to their grant application. So if you're going to construct a competitive grant program, it's going to also need to be really tightly constructed so that you're not getting sort of these broad proposals to save the world. This is the thing specifically that we want you to study.
I think from my experience, I would look at this as sort of a seed funding opportunity. So a lot of the agencies that most of the researchers would go for, they have like a 6% success rate. So very, very low. So this is an opportunity to make those proposals more competitive if they have some preliminary information or some data that's been collected. That's where I would look at this fund as being really essential to making them, the researchers, much more competitive at that 6% success rate. Otherwise, it just sort of delays the work getting done because of that really low success rate. So
I would add, building upon what Commissioner Loism just mentioned, the more specific this research can be relative to our needs for the agricultural community, the better. There's a lot going on in research, destruction, mitigation in soil and water already. So I'm not necessarily seeing that as a priority area, whereas the research on cropping systems, uptake, livestock systems, et cetera, that's really what we need answers for, and we needed it yesterday. And through CDC, DEP, other partners, we're making small steps in that direction that have practical application for farms. But if we can use the limited dollars, seed money, et cetera, and be extremely focused on wanting it to be applied research relative to positive agricultural production, I think we'll be making strides. And I do want to say that the idea of a committee with the academic and structural experience of knowing how to gauge and assess research proposals sounds lovely. We do receive a lot of requests, and while we would love to be able to assess and say yes to everybody, we don't necessarily feel like we have at the Department of Agriculture the expertise and experience to do that level of assessment. So a third party, and there's a corollary in the lead program, right? Isn't there a
well, there's a
sort of
lead poison
advisory
for the lead poison prevention fund, but they're not serving a role of, well, it's kind of it's similar. They're not quite what we're talking about probably here, because it's a kind of a mixture of science and policy, et cetera, people. But it is a bit of a model. They're an appointed advisory committee to think about how we'll spend those funds. So within the context of all what the purposes of the fund are. But in some ways, it's more analogous to what this group already is, as opposed to what we're talking about here, where it's almost like the world that currently works in, right? It's you write grants in response to calls for proposals. You try to make them competitive. They have a review body that reviews them and scores them. And whether you get funded is whether or not you're in the upper 6% or you don't get funded. And that's, I think, sort of what we're talking about is how do you build that sort of review of proposals so we make sure that when we invest dollars, we're highly likely to get a product back that's going to be helpful and useful and will be completed.
I think the other piece to that too is that if these lists for the long term are sort of the priority areas, being able to return back to that regularly so that those priorities can be reevaluated. If something comes up and it's not in this list, you'd want to be able to send those to that grant panel as well so that you could solicit proposals. That's, I think, so to me, it's like that 2-tier. You sort of have the advisory, which maybe is this group, and then you have the review group. But I think being able to really update these priority areas is important. These are the ones we see now, but we don't know what that will be next year.
I like the idea of being a little bit proactive about what the departments need with regard to information and solicit proposals for research that specifically address the needs of the information that we need as a state in order to make decisions.
Armor, more information. It would be nice to actually say, yes, we know what we need, let's go get it.
So I think I'm hearing support for the concept focused on research that informs farming decisions.
Being mindful of the fact that there's other funding out there, that this should, right?
I would just put a fine point on, because we're spending state dollars, that we're working towards getting answers that the state needs in order to address how the state can best support farmers going forward and how the state can spend money to support farmers with our efforts of farmer support and land and health monitoring. So I'm good.
Beth, this is Becca. I just have a clarifying question. So right now, this group, we're deciding if, in general, we could support the use of these funds for example, a competitive research grant, and then the research subcommittee will discuss each of these rows that you have in this table in more detail.
Yes.
Like we're like approving in general that sure, that could be something that you all discuss as a research subcommittee as an activity. That's what's happening right now versus when the subcommittee meets.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
We're just doing the very broad strokes. Where are we going to direct our attention?
Or where could we direct our attention?
Or, yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, so these are not final determinations today by any means. It's a starting point. Where do we want to begin with our focus? Starting with our charge from the legislature. And then also in just a moment, I will be asking you, are there things that the legislature did not consider or did not include in this bill that we ought to be considering? So hearing nothing further, I'm going to scroll ahead to establish food safety criteria. Now, presently, food safety is regulated by USDA, FDA. There are a total actually of 15 federal agencies collectively administering 30 laws related to food safety. And there are also state and local laws and regulations. My thought is that this fund should not be delving into food safety regulations. I think supporting research into uptake into food crops is critically important, but then turning that into a regulation feels like it's beyond the scope of this fund. But again, I'd like your input.
I would kind of agree with that. And we're not the regulatory entity that,
Yes.
you know, I guess we could propose stuff to the regulatory entity that to make those determinations, but I think I like what you said, you know, supporting the research to gather the information so that the right agency can then make that determination.
I think it's critically important
This is
information.
Nerva. I
I'm not
concur
sure
with
it's
that.
within the purview of the committee based on the way that we put forth the legislation.
Was there somebody who was on the?
Yeah.
Sorry, Beth, this is Nir. I concur with what was said just a second ago. I think having the fund and the committee raise matters of food safety as it relates to PFAS is useful just to explore those issues, but getting into the world of setting boundaries around what constitutes safe, unsafe, adulterated, unadulterated, probably best left to the regulators, particularly given there are so many levels there between Maine CDC, Ag, FDA, Food Safety Code, all of those things.
Okay. So we can take that off our list. And then finally, related to research, are there other projects, other things we ought to be considering?
I'm only throwing this out here because I don't know if it belongs in any bucket or if it's in the purview of us, but what about research regarding the well-being of the people affected? You know, making sure that whether, you know, how this is affecting them, or something. How are we doing, right?
Right.
I don't know if it applies. I don't know if this is where it belongs, but I think we need to be really mindful of that. If we spend all our time fixing the land and fixing the animals and the food, and we are left with shells of humans, we may be in a really tight spot.
So under the heading of healthcare, mental health is something for us to consider. But research into mental well-being is separate from the provision of healthcare. So yeah, that's.
I want to back Jenny up on this because I think the national, one of the statistics that just came out is that farmer suicide is on the rise. And I think these are the kind of things that put people into really desperate situations where they're feeling left alone. And I want to just back researching what a farmer will need for their mental health while they travel through this.
Farmer and ag work.
Really important to me. Whether it's like, yeah, how to connect people or how to get someone through this and come out the other end, not that shell.
Yeah.
As we think about that, it will be important to make differentiations between, well, to talk about impacted communities, because you've got firefighters, you've got farmers, you've got landowners living on contaminated properties with wells. So I guess we just want to make sure we don't leave anybody behind when we start to talk about that kind of research and what our place is on this committee for that work.
Sort of somewhat related, community impacts of the economics. So I know we have enterprise budgets on this other sheet, but actually the research behind the community impacts, the economic impacts, I think is important.
I want to put that up because so often when it comes to ag, there's so many, we enjoy many exemptions. There is no data. Like when we want to talk about ag workers and compensation, there's no data, right? Unless there's a catastrophic loss, you know, that's the only time that they're going to get data. So I think it's important to be mindful that there is a probably at least research into what data is missing and how can we make sure that we can have a whole picture.
You think that's related to like the food that's in a community too? Like how much food is lost in a community, how much of nutrition and all that goes out the door at the same time?
Explain that.
Oh, when a local farm loses, you know, when a community loses a farm that they rely on as a nutrient and food source, if food is often brought from further away, the quality of it could be argued that it's lower quality, it's not as fresh, it's not as coming in. And then also, you know, the money that flows into a farm often flows out pretty quickly back into its community that's used to like buy, purchase, or hire other goods and services. So there's a fallout when that farm leaves. There's often this hole, and it's because we've exempted ourselves from the data so well, we haven't really shown like how much, you know, nutrient loss in a community comes when the food is not from its local community, but is 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks old, shipped from elsewhere with a different quality standard. I think is what I'm.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because I mean, we can go back and find data from 10 years ago that says in New England that every time you remove a single dairy productive cow, you are removing $13,000 of economic impact from that municipality. And that's really old data. And we know that that's changed and it's only gone up. But you also, when you talk about the food and the pressures on the other store, I mean, just on the availability and accessibility and affordability of that food and how that affects the nutritive quality and sustainable nutrition of the people that live and work in those communities. So, yeah. I mean, if we have a wish list here, this is what we're saying.
Wish list.
Yes.
Another variation on farmer health research that may not be present here is on cultural practices on the farm. So tillage versus non-tillage, is that changing exposure rates or different types of labor? Yeah, just exposure. Feels like it's certainly relevant to short-term immediate decision-making on the farm and has long-term consequences to farm strategy and operation design.
So I have well-being, economic considerations, exposure pathways. I'll ask the research subcommittee to consider those in addition to this list in the second column when they meet to think about how and what sort of research this fund ought to be supporting. So as I mentioned before, we have the start of our research committee with Amanda and Diane. Jenny and Keisha, you both indicated interest in being on that committee. Of course, you can be on more than one. It's a time commitment, obviously. So we don't need to make final determinations today, but give some thought now that you have a little more input from all of us on exactly what this subcommittee will be doing. You could let me know. Are there other folks here that are interested in working on the research?
I sent you an email, Beth. This is Becca. I would like to be on this subcommittee.
Okay. And Commissioner Loisman gave me the name of somebody from DEP to include as well. Are there other organizations that we ought to be reaching out to? Are there other academic institutions besides the university that are doing potentially this type of research? And I don't know what the other colleges in the state are working on. Schott Institute reached out to me and they may be on Zoom. They have done some research in the Blue Hill area.
I'm sorry, I keep coming out of nowhere. That's a body voice. What about the Silent Spring Institute? And then I had a question for Andy. I think you mentioned earlier that you were doing some work with Australia. I saw some human health related work coming out of Australia and Canada. I don't know if we want to go international with this group. I'm sorry, I just don't know the scope, like how big we want to go. So sorry about that.
Say any expert that.
Well, is this, are you talking about staffing for your committee to think about what to do research on? Because you may, I mean, 60 million sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot. And so you may want to think about parking your thoughts around health studies and the discussion around the blood testing and health monitoring group, as opposed to here, because health studies to be done well are really expensive. And then you should also be aware that there are a bunch of health studies underway. Firefighters, ATSDR, part of federal CDC, is funding 8 community level studies, cohort studies of populations exposed to PFAS across the US. There's international studies ongoing, epidemiological studies coming out almost every year, every week, practically. So there's a lot of research going on around the health effects of these PFAS chemicals. What I think there is, from what I've seen, very little of, is things unique to farmers specifically. and their unique exposure pathways and trying to understand and assess those. So that's an area that that I think is not well studied and well known to thinking about what does it mean to be out on a field with elevated PFAS, running a tractor, inhaling whatever you're putting up, et cetera. So it's just, we can't find anything published on that, and we're being asked about that. So there may be things around that, but is that kind of a biomonitoring health study as opposed to under research in this way? And I think you could sort of think about that. If you go down that pathway, if that makes sense.
What about somebody from ARS, Ag Research Service? I don't know enough about it.
They're certainly doing PFAS research.
So maybe if there's someone there that would kind of sit in on the committee, they might have some good info for you.
Yeah, at this point, just suggestions.
Right.
And I think Charlie has his hand raised from Shaw Institute.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for allowing me to join this. Yeah, very briefly, I'd like to be involved, if possible, in any research subcommittee. We started doing quite a bit of freshwater testing out in our area because we kept getting reports, on the news from cities like Surrey, towns like Surrey, and then closer to Blue Hill where we are, about high PFAS levels in water. And so we've been doing some testing in the community, and we've been putting together kind of a GIS map of the different levels that we're finding in different areas. So we can not only kind of help people to understand what their levels are looking like, but also try to figure out the source and narrow that down. More recently, we've actually expanded to working with a lab that does soil testing because we think some of the inputs might be from sludge deposited soils in the proximities of these schools and these other locations. And so we're now doing freshwater, we're doing soil. And if we can be of any help moving forward, please let us know. We've also been contacted, as I'm sure you've heard, with other groups by firefighters that are curious about looking into their own contamination levels and also trying to kind of enact these reduction strategies. So we haven't quite expanded into blood yet, although we have a lot of eager firefighters that are willing to make those blood donations. But as of right now, we've been doing a lot of freshwater and soil testing. So if we can be involved in any capacity, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that we can always have folks, especially if you're in the Zoom audience, send your recommendations for people you think would be a good fit for the research subcommittee onto that. Yeah, your convenience. Yeah, and that would apply to any of the subcommittees. So do we want to take a quick 5-minute break now? Stretch your legs, vending machines across the hall, restrooms down to the left. Great. 2:47. Good job, timekeeper.
It's like, if there was anything more.
Yeah, so I think we're doing well, we're moving a data set for,
Still primarily.
You guys ready to talk about farmer support?
No, financial.
Yes.
Will there be hugging?
For your call.
So I want to thank Beth for going through these tables, because I think doing that first section of research gave us a sense of what we're trying to accomplish, which is, I think, simply, should we be using this fund to address these particular topics? And in the interest of time, I think the conversation that we had was really good, and I don't want to in any way, shape, or form not have that robust of a conversation, but I do also want to keep in mind that we will be looking at subcommittees to really dig into these issues. So I think that top of mind question is this an appropriate use of this? So that's where I'd like to start. And we're gonna give us a few minutes. Yeah, we are about 20 minutes behind, so just letting everyone know that. So the first question is, should the fund assume responsibility for the Bureau of Agriculture's current income replacement program? And go ahead.
Sorry, question. Is this not income infrastructure? What subcommittee is farmer support under?
The income infrastructure
Is that-
business.
Okay,
development,
yeah,
yes.
sorry, thank you, just checking.
No, that's a great question. So thoughts? Senator Pettit?
Yeah, well, I mean, to the extent that there's money being spent, it's sort of a left-hand, right-hand thing, right? So, I mean, I would think that it would make sense to do this. It's similar to what we did with creating the Maine Connectivity Authority and the Connect Maine Authority, I think, you know, when on broadband, that we need to like have a holistic approach. So I would think so, unless I'm missing something.
I would suggest that we don't completely take over the income replacement from the Department of Ag, but if they could be the initial help at the farm first, and maybe the fund could be the more longer term support, that maybe we could work together.
Yeah, to be clear, our activities will remain the same, and tell me, Keisha, if I'm following your thought process here. It is super important that we jump in on the ground with folks to do the site assessment work, get a handle on all of the necessary testing, gauge the results, monitor, et cetera. All of that has to continue, and we're prepared to do that. The question then becomes, based on the data that we receive, you know, what's the long-term, what's the short-term, midterm, long-term needs of this farm? And there's a lot of different ways in which these farms can make decisions based on them. Some might say, no longer gonna farm here versus we're gonna stick here and see what we can make of it. The question that our Bureau has struggled with is, and as some of you guys know, relative to how we've set up an income replacement program, was a 12-month process to try and replace income that may be lost due to PFAS. It is not a perfect system. And it's also a very complicated and time-consuming process. And so the thought of possibly bringing it to a fund is not to say the department would no longer be involved or provide any of that critical information that helps people make a determination about what payments should be, et cetera. We will continue to do that. It was just a question of, can the income replacement program that we've set up, A, be improved or rethought or expanded, because who's to say it's right as it is now? And B, if that is going to be edited and changed, should that become a part of this fund and the subcommittee to oversee what that would look like? And I'm happy to do whatever the fund wants to determine, but I just want to make clear that we're okay with the income replacement going to the fund, but we know that we have to be a necessary partner no matter what ends up happening.
When we talk about this, is the money for the income replacement what comes from the farm, or the staff necessary that you need to work with it would be, does all of that structure also come out of the fund? No. So the infrastructure, like your people, come out of a different budget, and that the money that actually goes to the farmer would come out of the 60 million.
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm hearing yeses, but with some discussion about what the mechanism looks like, which sounds like a great conversation for the infrastructure committee.
You have a hand up in that.
Go ahead, Senator Bennett, sorry for that.
Yeah, just to make sure I understand how this is working. I mean, this council is just providing advice to the department. The department is the ones who's spending this money. And this is money appropriated to DAFs, to Department of Agriculture, Conservation, Forestry, right? So I think it makes sense to the people who are already on the ground administering, finding out what's going on, what the needs are, to be involved in this. To what extent is this a separate kind of administrative function here? I don't understand that part.
So I think, Senator Bennett, if I understand your question, there's a little bit of a question of what the structure looks like now versus what it could be. Is that, am I hearing your question correctly?
Well, my thought about this fund was, so the department's already doing certain things, right? Given its existing budgetary resources. Then there's this need that we don't really know what the need is, and so this council was formed to advise with a specific sum of money of $60 million with a lot of latitude to spend where it's needed, but it should be done not to replace, if you will, what the department's already doing, but to supplement that. So we wouldn't want to, for example, be spending the $60 million on, on personnel that the department already has in place doing work, and right. But I think it's to identify where we can be helpful. I'm just wondering on an income replacement in particular. It looked like there was some money being spent in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range. And we don't know how much more that's going to be needed, but I would just want to, this isn't a separate administrative structure, I guess is my point. This is about, the purpose of the council isn't to administer funds, it's to decide where the need is and recommend the spending of the funds on those particular needs. And it seems like income replacement is a critical one. I mean, also on the list here, we've got specific kinds of assistance like mortgage, et cetera. And I guess the working group would dig into that as to, what's, do you help with the income level, or do you help with particular expenses, and why would you do that? But I don't think there's any sort of separate administration, is there, or related aside from Beth? I mean, is there expected to be any sort of separate administrative structure regarding this fund?
I don't believe so. And what I just heard you do was volunteer to be on the income infrastructure committee.
Yeah, well, looking at all of them, that would make the most sense given my background. So I'm happy to do that. I don't know much about farming. As Senator Brenner will affirm, I know very little about farming, but I do. I'm interested in this area because I think it's critical.
So I'm hearing yeses on this first one, that this should be something that that the infrastructure committee looks at in terms of potential use of this. Yes. The next question is, should the fund make mortgage payments?
I think this is like one of those things where it's like potentially yes. I mean, some of these questions are like potentially yes, right? Like, I don't know. It's like, are you just looking for like are you more looking for no's in some ways right now than like than anything else?
Same question.
And does mortgage payments, is that a subcategory of income replacement? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I guess the question is this something that we want the infrastructure subcommittee to talk about?
I would like to speak from a place of experience with the income replacement fund at our farm, is that I would feel really uncomfortable receiving a mortgage payment after my income has been paid for, because my income is based on a budget that pays my mortgage. And so it seems like an income replacement would be the capture of all that, and specifically to a mortgage would seem a little too dialed in for a fund. It's a little too far into the detail, because then we'd also have to go through like, well, you want to talk about my fertilizer bill or my seed bill? Because that is bigger than my mortgage in some cases. So it seems like income replacement covers that. But I would say that this might not be a good place for talking, or I don't know if I'd like to spend much time on mortgage payments so much as income replacement.
Anyone else?
So I had more or less the same question, like, why are these both here? And what I came up with as a possibility was, say it's a new farmer, hasn't been on the property very long, doesn't have a significant history of income, and their mortgage payment is actually higher than their past income. I don't know if that's a situation that the Bureau has seen, but that's my reasoning when I was wondering why mortgage payment was identified as a specific expense as opposed to income with which all of us pay all of our expenses.
I don't know if we've seen that in particular, Beth, but I think what we have tried to be open to is if there's a farm that in the early days of being told that PFAS contamination is a reality and they have pulled their products and income has ceased or is extremely limited, there are, probably mortgage payments among other things that need assistance. And we know as a department that waiting to get all these test results, et cetera, takes a very long time. So are there some necessary, maybe payments that could be covered, not necessarily forever, but to assist in that gray zone where no one quite knows where they're going to land just yet and income is questionable. And then there's also other outstanding loans that they may have, and it might not be tied to real property, but it could be equipment. It could be other things that, again, compounded if they're thinking I'm never going to be able to get a loan again, which hopefully is not the case, especially in Maine, because I think lenders are becoming more aware of and savvy to us. But, there's just a question of how are they going to be able to continue to pay the bills for all the things that they have debt service on their farm.
Adrian? I guess I was just thinking the flip side too, like if income replacement, and I'm just trying to think about well, there's two different things, like what happens when a farm no longer can be in production but they're still paying a mortgage on a piece of land, they're planning to make their income from that land. How does that play into decision making? And then also on the flip side, depending on where we decide income placement falls, whether it's a 12 or a 24-month period, and there's land that someone has said spreading on that they aren't going to be able to grow on, or not going to be able to do what they were planning on. I'm not validating this is like the right use of the fund, but I guess I wouldn't want to negate that there might be situations where for the long-term viability of that farm, even if there's like a portion of land that they can't produce on, but they also can't get rid of or whatever, where does the liability fall? And I'm not saying it makes sense for this fund to do that, but I'm just kind of curious. I wouldn't want to put it under the table, no, we wouldn't fund mortgage payments, I guess.
I think it would behoove the subcommittee to have a discussion on actual mitigations that may go beyond income, like mortgage, other debt services, or other ways of delaying or making sure there's understandings with lending institutions. And I don't know if we have the ability to make recommendations for possible further legislation that might be needed to protect them, but this is where it comes up. Like maybe the fund doesn't have the authority or the ability to help these things, but these are things that would be helpful for these long-term and short-term needs of the farmers in question and producers of our food.
Does using the term financial assistance make sense? Then necessarily, and it's a question for the group, then necessarily laying out here where that conversation should go and what types of financial assistance should be pursued. Just to
Like that income replacement was originally, correct me if I'm wrong, Nancy, but set up to, capture 12 months of lost income. So if we have a farm that's gone past that 12 months, but they're still mediating the problem, the fund might not, the income replacement fund might not be able to give them any more lost income, but maybe that's when we'd have to step in to pay maybe the mortgage payment while they're still mediating the issue. But outside of that first 12 months of income replacement, right? You don't want to be duplicative and give them income replacement and then give them money to pay the bills that normally would come from the income.
I do think this is gonna be a focus of the infrastructure committee, this conversation and how, maybe making some recommendations and suggestions about how this would be structured. So I'm hearing a yes on financial assistance. Okay. In equipment, facilities, and infrastructure. So, Bureau of Ag has a, thank you, Senator Brenner. Bureau of Ag has a cap of $150,000 on infrastructure, assistance for feed, new wells, new equipment, fencing, and will pay for testing, filtration of farm water, livestock, and farm water and livestock indemnification. And the fund could potentially support infrastructures on farms. What does the committee think? Yes or no? Yes. Should the fund support infrastructure improvements in excess of $150,000?
Yes. And I can give an example. We just put in an application for pivoting to more grain production on our farm. And we already have about $150,000 worth of grain growing equipment, tractors, combines, grain wagons. We have a grain bin on the farm. But in order to increase our grain production, to be able to feed all of our hogs with grain produced on the farm, we need to invest in over another $150,000 worth of grain bins and equipment to get there. So that's just a specific example on our sort of medium-sized farm. So I think there is going to be a need for larger investments on potentially larger farms than ours.
The discussion needs to happen.
Yeah, I would 100% agree.
Senator Bennett?
Yeah, I agree with this too, but I just question, what is the size of the current program and where do those funds come from that the department's administering for less than $150,000?
That's all part of the department's budget. The legislature approved $10 million the prior biennium and another $3 million. So from there on out, we are operating with a $13 million budget, which we now have about $6.3 million remaining. The rest is encumbered, hasn't necessarily all been spent, but those encumbrances include set-asides essentially for income replacement, for infrastructure investment, for farm depopulation, for water, for testing, for a database, et cetera. So there is a time limit, essentially. Those funds will run out one day.
Okay, you spent about half of them in about a 2-year period or encumbered them.
Encumbered, yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So are you seeing an increase on the demand as time goes through, or is it pretty much level? Or
that's an interesting question, and I've tried to figure out how to answer it in advance, and it's not a great answer. It depends. We actually received a small number of income replacement that early to midpoint of the year. We've received a number of them now that harvest season is over, and I believe some farmers are in a better place to request the support. So I think it's consistent, but it hasn't been overwhelming. And I feel comfortable saying that I think we are in a good spot to continue. But if we were to all of a sudden receive a lot of requests, then I'd be a little more nervous.
is this the same pool of funds that we're talking about from income replacement as well as this this infrastructure, this equipment, et cetera? 150,000?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
I guess just related to that, do you feel like what's your projection on how long that? I mean, the money that you have feels like it's much more volatile, right? And so I guess my question is this 150,000 the right place to be, or is it should be even lower, like in the sense of 5 years from now? Or if once we get this advisory committee up and running and farmers feel like, oh, maybe I will seek support because it seems like there's some support out there for me. I'm really curious how that will play into what the capacity of your budgets will be able to do.
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of curious how
That's a great
will play
question,
into
and I have asked our business administration team to sort of start trying to look at the data and crunch some numbers. It's really impossible right now to say there's an average farm
Yeah.
number, but we'd like to be able to maybe have a spectrum that we could kind of try and start forecasting off of. I think one of the reasons, and I've said this before, that in a way it would be nice to have income replacement covered by the fund, and we retain 150 and below for infrastructure, because I feel like we could do that more quickly. I don't know if that will always be the case. Maybe over time, everything becomes a little bit more regimented. But if we know that farms are going to need more than $150,000 of infrastructure investment generally, I feel comfortable saying that in most cases, between crop assistance, new equipment, some sort of renovation, whatnot, will approach $150,000 potentially pretty quickly. And that will start depleting our funding over time. Now, looking ahead, I think our commissioner would very much appreciate legislative support in the coming years that is not $13 million for the department, but some more modest. But that would cover definitely our personnel, our testing, and then probably this infrastructure. And I don't quite know, but in time, maybe we'll have a pretty sound idea of what that would look like on an annual basis. So we would hopefully try and get that in addition to if the fund can continue to get outside replenishment, that would be the ideal situation.
Senator Brett, your hand's up. Is it still up or do you have another question?
Apologies, no, I forgot to lower it.
Great.
I know we're short on time, Jess, but I just want to say, I feel like for me, the ultimate responsibility of this fund is to figure out the best way to support existing farms to continue being current and existing farms. And so if it means that we lift a cap and we don't have a cap, because the cap seems somewhat arbitrary to me, because it's very much predicated upon scale. Like if Steve's farm needed a big change in order to shift gears, it's going to be way more than $150,000. And we certainly don't want Crane Brothers to go out of business as a result of something like this, right? So this is, I think, one of the sort of paramount pieces of what we're here to do, which is to figure out how to keep folks in business whenever possible. The sort of last resort is that they have to move off their property. So I feel like the cap is arbitrary and shouldn't be there.
Yeah, I'd like to share that. I think of $150,000, it's like really not that much money on the farm
No.
when it comes down to it. And I think I'd like to see the cap gets removed, right? Just to
Well, so there is no present fund cap on the PFAS fund. There is a cap on the bureaus.
maybe I don't understand.
When we
If
move
I
it-
want to support having a cap on the discussion, I think I don't want to have a cap on the discussion
we want to
in
move
the
it to
committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Right.
want to move it. to
That's, yes, maybe I said
We want to support infrastructure improvements in excess
excessive.
of the current $150,000 cap.
Yes, sorry, I read that wrong. That's my. All right, now I'm straight.
I
Thank
think-
you. Thank you.
I think the infrastructure committee, it's safe to say, will be discussing the intersection between what the department's doing, what the fund can do, and where that cap should be if there's a cap. So the next question is regarding enterprise budget. So the question is, should the fund pay for consultants to help farmers determine how best to move forward. And then the question would be, what sort of technical advice would help farmers make business planning decisions? And who are the relevant experts and organizations? For instance, Maine Farmland Trust. So we're looking for a yes or no. Is this something that we'd like the infrastructure committee to put on the table?
Yes.
We're getting better at just giving you the yes or no.
I mean, again, I really don't want to shut down the discussion at all, but I think if, as a general rule, if we can agree that, yeah, we'd like them to talk about this, then that group can have a more robust discussion. Moving into long-term uses of the funds, relocation of commercial farms, buying and selling land contaminated by PFAS. There is no current program that does this, and the question is, could this fund establish a program to relocate and or buy and or sell contaminated land?
The discussion needs to be had, and this is the group to do it.
Yes.
And then are there other, did I miss anyone on? No. Okay. Are there other potential uses or potential things that we'd like the infrastructure committee to discuss? Okay. Oh, go ahead. No, go. No, you don't apologize, David. That's what we're.
I guess the thing that I'm really curious about, and I don't know where this lands, if it's really, because it's more of like a personnel thing, and I don't have enough clarity with like how this really works with a fund and capacity at DACF or at the Department of Ag, of just like technical service providers. In the capacity within the department of what that is and what level of experience we could. I don't know if this fund is the right place for that, or but I think whether it's specific to PFAS or it's kind of like this issue, not what I'm seeing of just like a lack in our state in general about with certain aspects of support for farmers, especially when they're going, like we're talking about supporting business planning, but it also like, is it worth having like, and maybe it's just personnel not a thing, but just like, is it worth having a deeper bench to help support farms within the department, whether it's within the department or how that would work, but just kind of curious about that. Something to entertain or just put out there as a potential support for farms.
I'm certainly all ears for any suggested feedback about improvements that the department could bring to the table, whether we have it now or not. And it could always be a recommendation of this fund to request the legislature to allow us those personnel. But certainly starting first with what is it exactly that is, you all would like to see is a great place to have that conversation.
Yeah. I think one of the most beneficial things that's going to come out of these subcommittees is recognizing needs that are in place, whether they're under the purview and mandate of this committee or council or whatever, and then figuring out who's going to pick it up and take that bob.
I think a discussion that might want to be had too is how to deal with the lending institutions that have turned you down for a year because you have PFAS, and how to convince them to allow you to borrow more or work with them. Because I think personally that's where we're having our biggest struggle right now.
Processors. I said processors as well. Yes. So any our markets. I don't know where that falls in. How do we ensure that we have a market?
And public perception.
Yeah, I would think that this is, making sure that the ecosystem of the economic ecosystem of agriculture stays intact for those who are dealing with this. And that may be something this working group would want to look at. And it might be, for example, debt guarantees for payments with lenders, maybe something at Fame to complement their current programs, but special for farmers or agricultural businesses that are suffering from PFAS or something like that. And it could be a way of leveraging these dollars very effectively. But it's not only in debt, it could be in other aspects of dealing with suppliers and in all that area. So I would think that we'd want to think about such things. It's a good idea.
I think those are all great questions and all really good ideas. And that's why we're here, right? To have these discussions and to generate sometimes more questions than we necessarily have than answers. So I really appreciate the discussion. I do want to just ask, do we have a fairly comprehensive list of folks who are who want to be on the income infrastructure and business consulting committee? And let's just make sure that everyone who wants to work on that committee is listed on the board, and then also taking suggestions about who else who isn't there, what other organizations might we want to invite to participate in that conversation in the subcommittee.
From the university side, some of what you just talked about, perception, those economic questions are being addressed. So I could definitely suggest someone from economics or even the business school.
Or social scientists. So
Caroline Noblet.
It might be useful to have somebody from Fame at least present to that group, but maybe even participate, since they're very aware of the programs that are available for businesses in Maine and how this might fit in with them.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Who did you name? Fame.
The Finance Authority of Maine.
And probably someone from my agency too, whether it's me personally. I'm willing to buy time, but either me or someone from my staff.
maybe NRCS.
Possibly an RCS, especially for like the technical service providers.
And also private service providers, Andrew Carpenter possibly, for someone from his firm. They've been very much involved and may be able to provide a lot of.
They may also be good on the research.
Yeah.
Research, they would be better.
Who's that?
Andrew, like Northern Hill.
For like the research. Would it make sense to have anyone from, like, I would wonder about like MFT or MAPA who's actually been on the ground, like kind of like in short term helping some farms with some of this stuff, and they'll do a lot of I'd say business or connect with a lot of business planning work.
And perhaps the Maine Bankers Association of the Credit Union League. Just inside the box.
This
committee might break out into multiple.
A specific discussion.
Yeah.
And then we'll walk out with that information. Yeah.
Beth, the other thing I'd like to suggest is we passed a law around land banking last session for potentially for contaminated land, and it might be interesting to explore how, if that's up and running and who's involved in that, because that could be really helpful to the land.
So was that the one like for municipalities to purchase contaminated land? Okay, yeah.
You might need someone from general funds in the lands group. If it's gonna be a state.
Okay.
With the income infrastructure business, maybe someone from like an Austin and Associates who's like doing a lot of taxes for farms, because taking this income replacement and this stuff is a massive tax implication, and income revenues and cash flow charts that like are a lovely puzzle to work through.
That's a great idea. I found that in dealing with similar problems, there's usually in Maine, there's usually like one or two like known experts that everybody goes to on the business accounting side in a big given area, and they like know where they just have so much information. It's just if there are such people in the agriculture community, that would be great.
And also somewhere find a place for the Maine Municipal Association so that we can make sure that they're able to provide information that may be something we don't think about with regards to town managers and town businesses and also rather not the Maine Municipal Association, but whoever handles all those town managers, because
You're right.
it's
So are you thinking for infrastructure, land, or both?
I'm not sure, but I know that I deal a lot with my town and they have very little information and they're relying upon me, and I don't know if that's the best plan they've ever made. But
All of Clinton or the like,
just the one person. But I mean, also, they're also getting the information from other people and it is incredibly erroneous and.
Yeah. And I think if there are any additional suggestions, we can, anyone out there listening about, folks who might be a good fit for this can send a message to Director Valentine.
Can I suggest one more farmer support to be added to the income and infrastructure? In the event that a farm has livestock that are not going to be able to be decorated in a reasonable amount of time, I think that we should consider livestock replacement, because the values that the depopulation pays aren't necessarily the values that you can go and purchase a similar herd or flock or whatever for. So I think that's something that should be added to the list for the subcommittee to consider.
Thank you. I think I'll turn it over to Senator Brenner to walk us through the health piece.
I'm gonna lean in on my friend over there.
Back.
All right. This can get expensive, this piece. So let's start with our first. All right, so we have the fund pay for so existing programs. This is a short and long-term item, existing programs. There's guidance, but no coordinated program for testing and monitoring. NASM advises clinicians to offer PFAS blood testing to patients who are likely to have a history of elevated exposure. And as we talked about last time, it's available through Quest. We've been doing some investigation. And my investigation so far is that Nordex would consider contracting with the same company as Quest, but everyone would prefer to have an in-state option eventually. So that's what's currently happening. Would the fund like to pay for blood testing for underinsured and uninsured individuals? What is the role for the state in blood testing services? Should the results from the testing be reportable to the state? And I did mention, I think, in here that there will be 2 bills in this legislative cycle to mandate private and public insurance cover PFAS blood testing. So hopefully we can take that insured population off of our list of things that we would cover financially. But I'll just say I think this is all quite needy, and this we should have the subcommittee consider all of it when they're working through their deliberations about what to prioritize. Important to have the discussion.
Yeah, this is Nirav. I concur with all of those.
Okay, another short and long-term item, medical monitoring and medical care. Recommendations from NASM can be incorporated into routine medical office visits currently. And the question for the fund is to support measures to ensure that the recommended monitoring is provided to people found to have elevated levels of PFAS, develop and share PFAS educational materials for clinicians. Should we weigh in on the broader access to healthcare issues? Healthcare is 20% of the national GDP, so I think probably we should stay out of that issue as a committee. But I do think that encouraging the development and perhaps funding the development of educational materials for clinicians probably isn't the worst thing in the world to spend our time on. But perhaps an item for the subcommittee.
Likewise, these read great to me. If Dr. Smith is still there, I can't quite see from the camera, but Dr. Smith, there you are. If you have additions or subtractions to any of these, please weigh in.
Mental health care, so supporting access to mental health care for impacted farmers is crucial. Currently, this is being covered under MAFCA and MFT and populated pension.
Can I add here that I think that something that would be beneficial for the fund to support, if possible, is sort of helping farmers that are impacted connect with other farmers who've been impacted, because I think peer support is really important.
Great.
Really sucks to have to spell PFAS to someone just so they can listen to your problems.
This is a long-term issue, and I think this is going to require quite a bit of discussion, but what an exposure study might look like to determine how farmers are exposed and impacted differently from the general population, which I think we got into a little bit earlier. Seems worthy for the committee, subcommittee.
Could it involve getting back to blood testing? So if you actually looked at them as an individual cohort, like they're doing with the firefighters.
Where do we house it all? What do we do with it?
And who does it? Who undertakes the study, designs the study, gets the results? All that would be something to be discussed.
And last thing on this list is, does the fund have a role to play if and when disease is discovered? Those are all hard questions. It's like $60 million.
Like if one of us ends up with cancer, how fast does the 60 million bucks run out as a result? You know, I guess it's a great discussion, but the realistic nature of the fund isn't going to cover.
I think what I struggle with, like some of these questions too, is like, this is like a kind of agriculturally oriented fund, but these are the issues that, you know, my neighbor that's not a farmer, but lives next to a farm that's contaminated well, also dealing, you know, with. And so like, how do you, if it's like supporting just like, do we only support a subset of like the impact? Yeah, it's just like, it seems like maybe bigger issue than what we think accomplishing.
Didn't the statute speak to that? I thought when it came to blood testing, health monitoring, it mentioned farmers and people with highly contaminated wells. I thought it just talked about people with highly contaminated well water.
Right.
Probably related to land application. I think if that's my memory is correct.
I believe you're correct. It refers specifically to well water and land.
I think, Adrian, that
Yeah,
they would
come
get
up
sort of
with
looped in
discussion.
potentially with that.
Yeah. Why don't we put that into the column of letting the subcommittee have conversations about? It does seem like, Jim, you're right, it would go quite quick if there were to be a disease that were to be discovered elsewhere. So I think this is meaty enough that it's worth letting the subcommittee dive into most of this and not really taking anything off the list currently for what we would hand them. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. And then we have this other column. You want to ask if they're. Oh, focus for the committee.
Okay, before you, can I ask a question? Within that, which I think should be a focus topic potentially for the subcommittee, is just thinking through, is blood testing and health monitoring going to largely be adoption of the medical model and doing what we can to support and improve the medical model? Or is there a specific role for the state to play in that at all? And where's that role? So I just think that should be part of the discussion of the subcommittee, to just sort of think through that, so we just understand what responsibilities there are and how much, have a good, robust discussion of how much can we really count in the medical model. Take care of this, how much is it going to be, need to be taken on by the state, and what does that mean? What would be the resources to do that? Yes.
By medical model, you mean a patient goes to their individual primary care physician?
Or does a blood test, the provider then educates them about the blood test, the provider does the medical monitoring, versus there's more of an active blood testing program, say at the state health lab, just like there is for blood lead. There's follow-up on it, just like there is for blood lead. So it's just thinking through those two different models and which one is going to most meet the needs of the people of the state and what the advisory committee wants to do.
And where do they need to be knitted together?
And where do they need to be like integrated together, and how do you potentially use one to fill the gaps, the others, like the short-term gaps clearly going to be the uninsured and the underinsured. And legislation will take what, 1 to 2 years before it actually.
For mandate.
For mandate.
Yeah.
So it's what do we do between then and again, just thinking through that.
Hopefully our friendly insurance companies will just support the word.
When we use the word farmer here, are we talking about farm worker, farm children, or are we talking about just the primary owners and operators of a farm? Because I don't have kids, but this wouldn't speak to if I had a child. Like, are they getting the blood monitoring? Are they getting the health research and stuff done on them? And on top of that, we also don't have employees, but there are plenty of farms that do. So are they getting the same resources, because they're just as important to the farm as the farmer itself, and often could be more exposed. Where if I'm the farmer and I'm sort of step back and I don't really go out in the fields, but I'm sort of managing the whole thing, my workers could be far more exposed than I could. So how are we defining farmers in this moment? Farm worker, farm employee, the richer owner, the owner on the top, and what about their family and children that are part of the farm operation? That might be a good discussion to have, how this shifts to them as well.
Making sure that they're included.
Making sure they're included.
Yes, I know that all of those are defined. And I brought up ag workers earlier in our discussion, so I think it's important that you brought it up.
Thanks for that, Jim. Anything else on this topic? Any folks we want to tap on the committee?
I don't know if it may be applicable or, but I do know that few of us kids are working with Dr. Abby Blake.
She's great. And again, you can always send recommendations to them.
Don't know if Maine Mobile Health would have the people to spare, but it might be helpful to make sure that people who deal with workers daily in the health scope.
Sorry, who?
Maine Mobile Health.
Any others? I don't have a specific name to give you, but I think it would be important to have someone from the sort of mental and behavioral health community. just as a placeholder. Okay, you guys ready for other? Last topic. This sort of gets to topic we talked about earlier, just around messaging of education for affected and adjacent landowners, guidance for buying and selling land where sludge and septic has been applied. Where would we place a discussion like that in terms of subcommittee? I suspect at some point down the line will be decisions about whether or not you need to disclose.
Within the land subcommittee, could we also address the adjacent landowners and their without asking if we could that in the land subcommittee? Just the land part of it anyway, maybe not the educational program.
It's like a great project for like a master's student. At least the educational program.
It seems like some of that should be in the health section as far as if you have a farm that could have affected your neighbor's wells, that there should be some mechanism for. I mean, I guess DEP is sort of dealing with that right now, but.
I mean, you guys have, both agencies have quite a bit of detailed information on your websites, and every time I'm on there, it seems to have grown. Another long-term item is marketing to counter potential negative public perception. Perhaps Jim Britt might want to participate in one of the meetings. I think this kind of goes under the income infrastructure and business section, just as a talking, I think, to make sure that the committee talks about. And regional planning. I mean, I think all of you have been participating in this work now, just traveling around and sharing your information regionally and nationally as requested, and folks have interest, but I do suspect that the work that comes out of this committee will be of interest to others nationally who are going to find themselves in a situation where they need to stand up to support their farmers. So I'm not sure exactly what, if you had something else in mind about.
No, I think all of these are a little premature to talk about education and marketing and messaging when we're still at the very beginning of building the programs. I'm thinking these will all become clearer as we move along. But where you've tagged different subgroups to talk about some of these issues, good place to start.
I'd like to add a database. So I know Nancy's been talking about that. So maybe that goes under the research infrastructure, but I think that's something we would need to consider at the very beginning. How we build that, if, you know, any collective data goes into that, it's going to be a remarkable resource. So.
I can speak to the fact that there's a multi-agency effort to build a PFAS specific database that meets the needs, which are shared but also individual between the agencies. It excludes DEP, DACF, CDC, and IFNW. And we want it not only to be a data repository that we can pull from and utilize for lots of different reasons, but also almost like case management as well for our field agents working with farms. So we're on our way. It's going to be hopefully some minimal viable product will be debuted in the spring of 2023. But I do hear you, what you're saying, Roland, in terms of the data that will be generated from research. Is that where you're kind of going a step further?
So I used to work with a machine learning colleague. All data is important. So honestly, it's everything because that's the techniques that we now have. So, you know, thinking ahead and figuring out how those different data streams pair together and are collated together would be wonderful. I think we don't know necessarily what the combinations that are going to be important or can provide the answers that the variability that we're looking at and the health outcomes.
With regards to the regional planning and the idea of us talking about what we're doing, I think that's like so key. We've all, the farmers have expressed this lack of networking and being able to speak to someone who knew what was going on and how that initial period is so difficult. When I'm talking nationally and when I'm speaking in national forums, there are people that are they don't think it affects them. That's a big enough hurdle, but there are also people who are getting information from farmer-funded groups or lobbying groups telling them to be vigilant against any work in this field, any type of action or legislative work or policy work or anything to do with PFAS, because it will put them at risk of further regulation or loss of market. Having the ability to actually share with them what we're doing, like when you sent the link to the website being live, it was extremely helpful. So I think all of us being mindful of having that resource already, and being able to show that this is the work being done and it's being done and it's productive and it's positive and it's helpful, and you can't ignore it because it's not going to go away because it's a forever chemical. But I think that that's something we can do in our everyday when we have the opportunity. I really appreciate the fact that we have these resources already and that we can work to improve them.
Any other topics that we haven't covered in any of that we just want to make sure we get on the list for the subcommittee? And I would imagine these subcommittees are going to have plenty on their plate, but I'm not sure there's more to come up.
One that's occurred to me when we were talking about what do we do when somebody discovers that they have cancer. I haven't heard us talk about legal services.
So I think that brings us to the end of considering subcommittees, and Beth, I'm going to pass it on back to you. Okay. So next steps. Let's do that. The agricultural trade show is coming up January 10th through 12th. We have time scheduled on both Wednesday the 11th and Thursday the 12th. Wednesday the 11th from 9 to 1 is going to be kind of a presentation of the state's response to PFAS, with presentations from Department of Ag, DEP, CDC, really with a focus on success stories so far. And that will be somewhat similar to our first meeting, kind of grounding everybody, what's going on with PFAS. And then 11 to 1 will be a listening session for this fund, inviting members of the agricultural community to learn about this fund, its purpose, its current status, and invite input on where the community wants to see funds directed. And also, I think I would like to ask folks to respond to what questions do they have? What kind of, what information do they need to make decisions moving forward? So what sort of research should we be focusing on, for instance? Are there other types of information we should be gathering?
Sorry about that. Was January 11th, 11 to 1?
Yes.
No wonder.
11 to 1 is our listening session. 9 to 11 is the kind of what's going on at the state level.
So Beth, I have two thoughts. One is 1 o'clock. This is for, I think for planning purposes, is 1 o'clock a hard stop? Or is it a goal?
I think it's a hard stop because of the space. But we have time, we have a room reserved for the morning of the 12th if we need it. The thing is, we're going to have to make that call. So that I can let the organizer know either we want to keep this space or we want to free it up for somebody else to use. And it's hard
to anticipate. This is just FYI, or you kind of want us at that session, so I've got another session to be at noon to 2, I think.
I
On
don't,
Wednesday.
I mean, I would love it if we could all be there.
I can pop in for a little bit before my other session as well.
Yeah, but I don't think it's imperative that you all be there. You know, whatever feedback you get, I will be sharing with all of you.
Is this gonna be, when you talk about PFAS in general, is that gonna be like beyond agriculture? Or is this 9 to 1-ish kind of like, is that all about just the agriculture focus of this?
Agricultural focus.
Because if it, yeah, I'd say keep the room if you want to talk like bigger picture the next day. 'Cause it would just be a pile. But if it's strictly ag, seems 2 hours.
Well, I want to point out that we're required to hold 2 public hearings each year, and the intent is that this is one of the 2. So I think it's really important for as many committee members to be there as possible, because it's our opportunity to hear from the public and hear from farmers. But not just farmers. I think there will be people from the public who are interested in this. So it's a public hearing, and so we should really all try to be there. It's hard to know whether 2 hours is going to be enough. It depends on the time, if we put limitations on how long people can speak. And that's something that Senator Brenner and I and Director Valentine will discuss. Sure.
Just to put a finer point on it, from 9 to 11, it's really the Bureau of Agriculture will give a presentation about what we're doing, what happens when we find a farm, some of the lessons learned, et cetera. We also have a colleague coming from DEP to give an update. So it's some of the information you've already seen, frankly. So please don't feel like you have to be there at 9. You're certainly welcome to come. But the public hearing, which is being discussed for a listening session, that's the 11 to 1. So I know your time is valuable. I just wanted to make that very clear.
And I'm sorry, what's going on the 12th?
Well, I have a room reserved.
Okay.
And I need to let the organizer know whether we're going to use it or should somebody else have the space. So we're not out now, so I really need to let her know.
Like if we were to have other types of presentation within that time? you're
No,
saying, or-
this would just be a continuation of the listening
Okay.
session. There won't be, I mean, other than sort of an introduction to what the PFAS fund is, there won't be, the breadth of the presentations that there will be on the 11th.
I think it would be best to do the listening session in one day, just get us all there one day.
Seeing
And-
head nods.
Yeah.
Unless you, I mean, just throwing this out there, if you wanted to have the second day for people that maybe they didn't want to speak publicly, if they wanted to come and talk to someone more 1-to-1.
Metro has a one-on-one technical assistance listening post tool where any members of the committee could sign up and say, if a farmer wants to talk to me about department's PFAS fund, they can sign up for a 30-minute slot, and there's sort of a mechanism there that already exists. And I'm sure anybody on the committee could talk to Ann to get registered and signed up. So it'd be publicized the same way a business coach would be publicized.
That's a good idea. That way you capture both the people at the public hearing as well as folks that want to have more of a conversation.
That's something that you could facilitate, i.e. be the person.
Yeah.
It's just an alternative on Thursday morning.
Right.
Someone missed it, you could give the recap and hear them out.
Yeah.
Some suggestions.
Yeah, I can do that.
That was terrific, that we just, I can say yes.
I've already got the time blocked up on my calendar. So, you know. Commissioner's she has a listening session on Thursday too. Just in general, right?
I think it's on farm bill priorities.
Stuff, yeah.
It is the first time in 3 years that we're all getting together, and I think there's a lot of pent up desire to do everything. And so there's lots of sessions, et cetera. So I think there will be a lot of competition for airspace, because there'll just be so many other things happening at the same time. So doing it, and I agree with you, Senator Brenner, about, you know, let's do it on Wednesday and
Okay. Sounds good. So kind of related to that, we'll have the listening session January 11th. I would like the subcommittees to meet in January. I'll follow up with you after this to try to, particularly where we have a lot of outside people to connect with. I'll be in touch with you about getting those meetings organized. So then I would like us to come together, you know, first or second week in February, just to share where the subcommittees are and, you know, what sort of feedback we got during the listening session. Discuss how to move forward from that point.
Do you want the subcommittees to meet prior to the trade show or anytime?
I think anytime. I don't think it's realistic to have them all meet, you know, with the holidays.
Yeah.
I figure a lot of people just won't be available. Thank you, everyone. That's it. Very punctual. Thank you.
2 minutes.
Just want to say that whoever's operating the camera has been great. It's been really easy to pay attention and thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I agree. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Good, are you? Nice to see you like.